Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to part two of the English Civil War. We're going to look at the events of the Civil War, kind of cover them very, very quickly, not go into crazy detail about the actual war, and then more importantly, the events that take place after the war. So take out the same set of notes that you had from the first video, and let's pick up with the English Civil War. So if you recall from the last video, the English Civil War started in 1642 when tensions between the king, at the time Charles II, who was a Stuart monarch, when tensions between him and Parliament that had been occurring for decades since the reign of his father James I finally came to a head. Charles fled London, he formed an army in the north, and Parliament formed their own army in London, and the stage was set for war. So supporters of Parliament during this time would be called the parliamentarians, or they would be called Roundheads, because supporters of Parliament cut their hair in this almost like bowl haircut that gave themselves this round look, hence they were called Roundheads. Don't think it was meant to be a complimentary nickname, but it's the nickname that has stuck. Now, supporters of King Charles would be known as Cavaliers. They tended to have their hair longer, a little bit more fancier, so the Royalists were called the Cavaliers. So basically, the Civil War is between supporters of Parliament, your Roundheads, versus supporter of King Charles, your Cavaliers. So the Roundheads tended to be more of the members of the House of Commons. They tended to come from South and Eastern England. They tended to be Puritans, merchants, townspeople, and more urban. So the Roundheads here, if you notice, guys, they kind of represent this growing professional and commercial group that we have seen throughout Europe that is growing in influence. Kind of similar to the nobles of the robe in France that we saw. The Cavaliers, on the other hand, were from the House of Lords. They tended to be more of this ancient nobility, mostly from northern and western England. They were large landowners. A lot of the church officials supported the king, and they tended to be more rural. I'm sorry. So they are the ones that support the king. So really, what this civil war comes down to, it's the nobility, or not necessarily the nobility, but this new elite group challenging the power of the king. So we're not going to get caught up in the crazy details of the war, the battles that took place, all of that. There's tons of information out there. If you're really interested in this, I can recommend an excellent podcast about the English Revolution that gives you lots of details. But for our purposes, just kind of let's skip to the end here, is that by 1645, the Roundheads, the supporters of Parliament, had gained enough victories to force Charles to surrender. So you can see this map kind of shows you from 1642, where you have your areas controlled by the Royalists and controlled by the Puritans, and how from 1642 to 1645, the land controlled by the Royalists is decreasing pretty steadily. So when we get to December of 1645, Charles is in a pretty bad position. He pretty much should surrender. But Charles, he's not going to go down without a fight. He is the king. He is a god on earth. He believes in divine right. He believes that he is the true monarch of England, and he's not going to come to an agreement. So what he does is he encourages uprisings and fightings against Parliament rule. At this point, the new model army now comes under the leadership of a man named Oliver Cromwell. Super, super important name here. One of the most important figures in all of English history is Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell kind of whips the new model army into shape. He wins some very decisive victories, and 2 years later, in 1647, now Charles was captured. So now not only did he lose the war, but he is actually captured and under the control of the parliamentarians. Now, Oliver Cromwell, super important guy. Here's a nice little explanation about who Oliver Cromwell was. So if you read this through, you can see very plain, very serious, very Puritan man. He's religious, and he believes that he has this purpose here, and that his purpose is to bring England to a better spot, a better place. And he believes that he cannot do this with the monarch of England in the way. So the question now becomes, what do you do with the captured king? He is the king. It seems like he's not going to work with Parliament. He's not going to agree to work with Parliament, so you can't put him back on the throne. But what do you do with him because he is the king? So Cromwell and his supporters decide that Charles should be charged with treason, that all of his actions that he took as king, all of the ways he challenged Parliament, what he did to the Puritans, his ship money controversy, all of that stuff was treason against the country of England. So he, Cromwell, pushes for Charles to be put on trial for treason. Not a very popular idea, believe it or not. People were not really too keen on wanting to kill the king. It was something that seemed very unnatural to take place. But what Cromwell does is any of the members of Parliament who did not agree with his actions, who did not think that Charles should be put on trial, he basically dismisses all of them from Parliament. And what he literally does is he placed armed guards outside the doors to Parliament with a list. And there was a list of people who agreed with him and a list of people who didn't. And if you were on that list of not wanting to support this trial for treason, you were not allowed in the building. Thank you for coming. No, thank you. You're not part of Parliament anymore. Goodbye. You have a problem with it. You can deal with these armed guards. Try to fight them. So at this point, there's barely 200 members that are left, really. So history has called this the quote-unquote rump parliament because it was cut down to only like a small amount of people. It's also been called Pride's Purge because I believe it was a Colonel Pride that was one of the people that were put outside of as these armed guards preventing people from coming in. So at this point, now you only have the people in Parliament who support Cromwell's idea of putting Charles on trial for treason. So the rump parliament put Charles on trial for treason. And what happens next is nothing short of regicide. What is regicide? Well, you see the "icide" part of it, kind of like genocide. So if you know what genocide is, you know it involves murder. The reg part, that means a king or royalty. So regicide basically means the act of killing a king. And yes, that's what happens. With the rump parliament now, Cromwell has left only the people that will find Charles guilty of treason there. Charles is found guilty of treason after a kind of show trial that took place. Although only 57 of the 159 commissioners that were assigned to this case actually signed the death warrant. But he was found guilty. So, on January 30th, 1649, Charles I, the King of England, was executed. His head chopped off in front of a large crowd there for treason against the English people. That will bring an end to the English Civil War. So if we're just keeping track here, the winner of the English Civil War is technically Parliament. Charles tried to stand up and exert absolute rule. They went to war, he lost, and Parliament won out. So now the question is, the king's gone. Typically, when the king dies, the next in line is his son or his heir becomes the next king. Well, Charles's son had, not shockingly, fled London, fled England. He's over out in France. He's run away. He's run for his life. He can't be there. They executed his father. He might have been next. So he leaves, and he's going to spend the next 11 years in exile trying to plot his return to England. So what do they do now? The monarchy didn't work. This monarch was convicted of treason. The Stuarts so far had been clashing with Parliament. So now what type of government are you going to establish in England? What they decide to do, the rump parliament and Cromwell, decide that they are going to institute a commonwealth in England. So the rump parliament then, after the execution of Charles, passes an act abolishing the kingship and proclaiming England a commonwealth. And we will now enter a period called the Interregnum, which was an 11-year period where England did not have a king. It is the only time in their history where no king or queen was ruling England. Now, this interregnum period is also divided into two parts. You have the first 4 years, which was the Commonwealth period, and then you have the last 6 years, which would be called the Protectorate. So the Commonwealth period is basically a constitutional republic. Cromwell and his rump parliament rule England together. They create a constitutional republic. A constitution called the Instrument of Government is written. That instrument of government provides for a strong executive, who is Cromwell, and a council of state that annually elected the Committee of Parliament. Now, most importantly, there was no monarch, no king here. So the execution of the king appalled much of Europe. Many countries don't recognize this government as legitimate. Now, during this 4-year period, there are many issues. A lot of people are uprising against this government. They don't respect it. They don't recognize it. They don't think it's a true, valid government. They don't think the king should have been executed. So you have uprisings that are occurring. And as the 4 years goes on, Cromwell realizes that him and Parliament actually aren't working so well together, and that a lot of the things that he's trying to do, he can't do because Parliament's standing in his way. So, in response to these uprisings, in response to the instability going on, Cromwell just kind of figures out, hey, if I don't do something, all this advancement that we've made, which Cromwell truly believed that they were making advancements and they were making England better by doing these things. Cromwell decides he can't do this with Parliament. So he dissolves Parliament, and he basically now creates a military dictatorship in England. So the Protectorate period will be basically Cromwell's rule. Cromwell will personally rule England with the military. So martial law is implemented. There's no more Parliament. It's Cromwell and the army, and they are ruling England. Cromwell allows religious tolerance for all peoples, except for Catholics. You're not going to be allowed to practice Catholicism freely. And Cromwell, being a very devout Puritan, institutes a very strict Puritan idea of morality. So think back to when we talked about Calvin's Geneva. What a civilization or a city that has the Calvinist idea of morality, what that city is like. Well, that's pretty much what Cromwell now does in England. He outlaws sports, theaters, games, singing, dancing, gambling. He actually goes as far as to outlaw Christmas. Yes, that's right. For a number of years, Christmas is not allowed to be celebrated in England because he kept the religious part of it, but really Christmas became kind of an excuse to party, an excuse to not go to work for a few days, an excuse to drink ale and drink yourself silly. So because of that, Cromwell felt, hey, that's all going to be outlawed. And yes, Christmas was canceled for a few years. He's also going to severely censor the press as well as freedom of speech. You still had that rebellion of the Irish Catholics going on. Cromwell goes through Ireland and crushes this rebellion, massacring thousands of people. If you go to Ireland today and you go to the native areas of Ireland where this rebellion was crushed and you bring up Cromwell's name, you are not going to get a great reaction from the Irish. His name is enough to just make the hair stand on their backs and their toes curl up. They still think of him as this disgusting human being who massacred and destroyed the Irish. So even though it happened hundreds of years ago, still something that impacts them. He's also going to enforce the Navigation Act. Now, if you guys remember, the Navigation Act was a mercantilist policy. The Navigation Act was something that said that English colonies could only trade with England and any other English colonies, and they could only use ships that were built by the English. So he's going to take some actions to do that as well. So not shockingly, Cromwell's personal rule here, this protectorate, was not very popular. We'll go through this later. So his rule was not very popular. And the question becomes, is he a Lord Protector, or is he basically just a king? Didn't we just go through a whole civil war to get rid of the king? And you justified getting rid of a king and establishing a commonwealth and a constitutional republic? But then it seemed like Cromwell was actually just acting like a king. So by the end of his reign, lots of people aren't very happy with the direction England is taking. And that will usher in the Restoration. So, in 1658, Cromwell dies. His son is supposed to take over rule of the Protectorate. However, his son was not nearly as powerful or charismatic or as strong as he was. So pretty much 2 years into it, the protectorate collapses. And years of military rule and years of discontent with this rule led the people of England to ask that the monarchy be restored. Hence, the Restoration. This is the restoring of the monarchy. So in 1660, Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, who had been Charles II had been living in exile these last 11 years, waiting for the opportunity to come back. He is asked to return to the throne. They restore Parliament, and they pretty much say, let's reset the clock and let's go back to where we were. However, there are some issues that are not resolved with the Restoration. What are those issues? The issues between Parliament and the king. And the religious issues. So pretty much the same issues that had started this civil war to begin with. The same issues that had caused James I and Charles I to clash with Parliament. The same issues that then erupted into war and led to the execution of the king. All of those issues had not been resolved yet. They pretty much were like, let's just go back to where we were before. So, not surprising, guys, there's going to be some problems with this restoration. Now, Charles II will end up ruling for 25 years, 1660 to 1685. He had charm, he had poise, he had political skills, very different from his father. He at least had some charm and he was able to work with people and talk to people. He restores the theaters and reopened all the pubs and brothels that were closed during the Restoration. On the surface, on the outwardness, on the outside, he favored religious toleration, but in reality, he actually had secret Catholic sympathies. And he said he shouldn't make the mistakes that his father did. But he did kind of make some of the mistakes that his father did. He just wasn't quite as strict and hardcore with it. So, you have your Puritan question here. The question of how to treat the Puritans. Well, Charles decides the answer to that question is to limit the rights of anyone who is not a member of the Church of England. So he returns to that policy of persecuting the Puritans. Then you have the Parliament question. Who is more powerful, the king or Parliament? So Charles tries to work with Parliament, but they end up arguing over money. Does this sound familiar to you guys? Same thing's happening. So what Charles ends up doing is he makes a secret agreement with Louis XIV for some money in return for gradually re-Catholicizing England. That's not going to go over so well. During Charles's reign, you also had some serious problems. In 1665, a plague hit London. And the following year, the Great London Fire took place. And this fire was the most devastating fire that had ever hit the capital. Destroyed a good amount of the capital city. So you have those problems, those issues. He's making secret deals with Louis. He's persecuting the Puritans. I mean, things are not going well. But Charles II was charismatic enough to be able to just kind of simmer down the tensions and not let the tensions boil over. By the time he dies in 1685, though, his brother is not going to be the same. So Charles II dies in 1685. Tensions had kind of been building up again, but because Charles was able to kind of calm them down, no serious problems. But in 1685, James II now becomes king. James II was a full-blown Catholic. He wasn't married to a Catholic. He wasn't the brother of a Catholic, the son of a Catholic. He was actually a Catholic himself. And he appointed Roman Catholics to positions of the army, the universities, and local governments. That did not go over so well with the Protestant Puritan members of Parliament. James also just began appointing his own judges. He decided to suspend laws at will, and it seemed like he was bringing back the absolutism of his father and his grandfather. So you can see very shortly into his reign, Parliament's like, no, we're not having this. This is not happening. We're not going back to an absolute ruler. We went through all of this. We already killed the king over it. We're not going to do this again. So Parliament, who is worried about the actions of James II, decides they need to remove him from power. So they secretly go to his daughter, who was married to William of Orange. Now, orange is not the color. They're talking about a place in the Netherlands. William of Orange was pretty much the leader of the Dutch Republic. You might recall him from when we talked about the wars of Louis the 14th. He leads that coalition against, or one of the coalitions against Louis the 14th. So William is married to James's daughter Mary, and William and Mary are both Protestants. So they're going to get rid of that problem of having a Catholic monarch. And they basically say, hey, listen, your father is not doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's trying to be an absolute ruler. We don't want him to be king. We will offer you the throne. So pretty much James realizes he doesn't have any support. He realizes he knows what happens to he knows what happened to his father when his father tried to fight Parliament. So lacking any support, James, his queen, and his son all flee to France, ushering and opening the way for William and Mary to come into London and take the throne. Now, because there was minimal bloodshed, there was no civil war, there was no fighting, James just pretty much left and William and Mary took the throne. This event has been called the Glorious Revolution that took place. So now the Glorious Revolution is a very important moment here in English history because the Glorious Revolution represents the final destruction of the idea of absolute monarchy in England. So how? Well, William and Mary accepted the throne from Parliament. Think about that. Parliament went to them and said, we want you to be king and queen. They are the ones that offered them the throne. So what this does is this establishes the idea of sovereignty. That if a king ruled without the consent of the governed, aka Parliament, they would be removed from power. It happened with Charles II. It happened with James II. They were trying to rule without Parliament, so they were removed from power. So what this event does, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, this firmly asserts the power of Parliament over the king. And this is why today England still has a constitutional monarchy, is because they established that tradition of a limited monarchy way back in the 17th century because of this English Civil War. So really this whole event basically establishes a limited monarchy, a constitutional monarchy in which Parliament is more powerful than the king. And take a second now and just think about the events that we've talked about here with the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Yeah, Parliament comes out on top. William and Mary will not get this throne unless they're able to work with Parliament. Now, in fact, before their coronation, William and Mary were required to sign the English Bill of Rights. And this Bill of Rights basically was a list of things the monarch could not do. So in order to take the throne, they had to agree to limit their power. Some of the main provisions here: the king could not suspend the operation of laws, the king could not interfere with the ordinary course of justice. There would be no taxes levied or standard army maintained in peacetime without Parliament's consent. There was freedom of speech in Parliament. The sessions of Parliament would be held frequently, so you're not going to see another, decade-long or more than decade-long period where a king doesn't call Parliament. Subjects had the right of bail, petition, freedom from excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. The monarch must be a Protestant. So here they are kind of dealing with those religious issues and saying we're not dealing with Catholicism anymore. From now on, the monarch of England must be a Protestant. People were free from arbitrary arrest, censorship of the press was dropped and rejected, and religious toleration was promoted. So you guys should see here, the Bill of Rights should sound familiar to you because yes, in our country, we also have a Bill of Rights. And you could see that there are some similarities between our Bill of Rights and the English Bill of Rights. And that's not a coincidence. The English settlers that came over from England and settled in the United States and then eventually made the country and the government of the United States, they had this tradition of this Bill of Rights from England that they brought over here. So we can definitely see the legacy of the Bill of Rights in American culture today as well. So most importantly, though, for this English Civil War is that William and Mary cannot become king and queen unless they agree to this. Very, very different to what happened at the same time in France. Louis XIV was not agreeing to anything, right? He wasn't signing anything. No one was limiting his power. So you see England and France here going on two very different paths. So to kind of wrap all of this up, what you should be thinking about here is how do the events in England during the 17th century compare to the events in France during the same period? As I've already said, they're going down different paths. They're not, the events that are taking place are not the same. So most importantly, what you need to come up with is what explains this. Why does France go down the path of absolute monarchy, and why does England go down the path of constitutional monarchy? So hopefully between what we've discussed in class, what was included in these two videos, will give you guys a sense of how to answer that question. As always with these videos, if you have any questions, please make sure you're writing them down. Come into class. Please don't be afraid to ask me. Feel free to ask me anything, any questions you might have about these videos or any of the lectures that have been going on. So that wraps up the English Civil War. We will end there, and I will see you guys in class.